While we begin, my name is Ron Lake. I'm from Lake Partners. I'll be the moderator for today's event, which is continuing a series, the Greenwich Roundtable, which is sponsored by Jefferies and Company. And I want to thank Steve McMenamin for all of his work in organizing this. Since this is the third anniversary of this series, to the day, we actually have a birthday cake for ourselves. Smuggled in from Chinatown.
Turned off the fire alarm just moments ago.
That's great, thanks. So it literally is 3 years ago to the day that we had our first Greenwich Roundtable session. And on that day, I think we had about 20 people here. And the S&P closed that day at the 665. Our topic was mathematics, common sense, and good luck. Our speaker was Jim Simons, the president of Renaissance Technologies and who runs the Medallion Fund. And here we are 3 years later. Again, to the day, we don't have 20 people, we have about 46 or something. So, and the S&P has gone from 665 to 1330 as of last night. So the S&P has doubled. Our group has more than doubled. So it's obvious that the Greenwich Roundtable has significantly outperformed the S&P with much less volatility, which we're very proud of. And the only, one of the very few funds I can think of with a better risk-adjusted return, of course, is the Medallion Fund. So it seemed that the best way for us to celebrate our third anniversary was to bring back Jim Simons and to reprise the topic of mathematics, common sense, and good luck. When we first spoke to Jim about doing this, he was a little concerned that coming back and giving talking about the same topic could be boring. I said, no, don't worry about it, Jim. Most of the folks weren't there 3 years ago, and those who were don't remember anyway. And you always have something very interesting to say about this. Now, there are a few people who were here at the beginning 3 years ago. Lloyd, you were here, Lloyd Haskell, and thank you for all your support in this event. I think Bill Fike was here, Kevin Boyle. Who else was here originally? Well, you all know who you are, and it's been a very interesting run. And to continue that interesting run, I will turn it over without any further ado to Jim Simons.
I'll stand. And I don't much care for these. Can you hear me? Is that right? Great. There's little chance that I'll repeat what I said before, since I don't remember what I said before in any of that. I have a constant title. Periodically I give a title, I give a talk, and give us a title, and I never think much of a title. So I invented this title about 5 or 6 years ago, and I've used it all the time. So if you ever hear I'm giving a talk, it will have this title, but its contents flow to some extent. The title is Mathematics, Common Sense, and Good Luck, which is a pretty fair summary of my career, as well as our present approach to trading. I'm a mathematician by background. I spent almost 20 years doing academic research, from 58 when I graduated college to 76 when I stopped teaching. And the mathematics that I did had absolutely nothing to do with finance. In fact, it didn't have anything to do with any particularly practical applications, such as geometry. On the other hand, it was, I met a lot of folks and had very good trading. In fact, when I started the investing business, I was really interested in the fundamentals and didn't bring mathematics to bear at all. We were just trying to build out, the usual things. What will the Fed do? What will the Bundesbank do? Et cetera, et cetera. But at a certain point, we did bring in mathematics. We started building models, and today, that's all we do. The funds that we run are essentially 100% based on mathematical models. And I'll tell you briefly what we mean by mathematical model. For one thing, what we mean is a model that can be tested. It can be tested with a lot of samples. So what we do is search through history, search through the data to try to find anomalous patterns of behavior in the data, patterns that would not be expected to occur at random. And we don't do that by just saying, okay, let's make a program that will generate every pattern in the world that we could possibly think of. We'll test them all, and maybe one of them will stick to the wall. That's not what we do. Although it's not a terrible scheme, but anyway, it's not our scheme. So our scheme is to think about what could be going on, either from things that we read or ideas that we get from looking at the data. Where's a good place to look for an anomaly? Recently, we had an idea, and we found this anomaly in a very, very small fraction of a particular universe. But it was a very strong anomaly, and it always occurred in the same fraction. And it was someone's idea to look in this particular area and see if such an anomaly would exist. Had you just looked at the whole universe of objects and said, look for this anomaly, you would not have seen it, because only 1% of the time series in this universe exhibited this anomaly, this kind of behavior. But where it does exist, it's strong and persistent. And that's the kind of thing we look at. So we look at some kind of behavior, anomalous behavior, and then we test it for consistency over time, the statistical significance, obviously. And we also test it, we test ourselves to think, well, does this make sense? Now, it presumably made sense to the guy who thought to look there in the first place. But, does this correspond to some aspect of speculative behavior or investor behavior that seems reasonable? There's an example of a famous correlation in the futures markets, the dreaded silver-soybean correlation. You look at correlations among all the futures instruments, and you take a long history of these. Well, gold and silver are correlated, and the Deutsche Mark and the yen are correlated, and 5-year bonds and 20-year bonds are correlated. Fine. Silver and soybeans, well, they're correlated. At least there was a long period that they were correlated. See, scratch your head a little bit. They both begin with S. What the hell should silver and soybeans? But it was significant. When we looked at it some years ago, it jumped out. It wasn't a huge correlation, but it was persistent and significant. What? Could I bet on this? If I see silver go up, should I say soybeans will be sure to follow? What sense could that possibly make? Well, at the end of the day, the reason for silver and soybeans having exhibited correlation is probably the fact that they were both relatively hot instruments at the same time. And the same kind of guys were dealing with it. And when someone would get a margin call on silver, he'd sell his soybeans, or vice versa. It was a cash flow was the only explanation we could come up with, because obviously the instruments have nothing to do with each other. But as we all know, if enough ships all go out at once, the rest of the ships are likely to leave too, because we're all selling, and that triggers margin calls and all the rest. So sometimes very unlikely pairs can end up having, at least for a time, similar behavior. In this case, it was for a long time. Anyway, that's what we do for a living. Now, what are the problems? There's a famous saying, garbage in, garbage out, which I wrote down. You're looking at a database, you better be sure that you know what you're looking at. A very famous debacle on a small scale happened in 1993 when some of the mortgage derivative guys went down the tubes. Most notably, a guy named David Aston or others, I think, who had problems at that time. But the whole industry took a hit. And they were pretty bright guys who were in this business, so why do they all take a hit? Well, interest rates went down. That caused prepayments to accelerate. And if you were holding interest-only paper, you would find that it was paying interest on nothing because everyone had prepaid his mortgages. Now, okay, that was the game, and gosh, we can model that kind of behavior, and people did model that kind of behavior, and as far as I can tell, came up with pretty sophisticated models. We will look back in history, we will see what the prepayment rate was at various interest rate levels. We'll throw in a family of possibilities around that. We'll integrate over all these things, and we'll come up with a risk model and a model for how folks will do under various interest rate scenarios. Fine. Except the world had changed, and there were factors that had nothing to do, or that were independent of the data. The factors, for example, that when you went out of your home or office on a given day, you might find under your windshield wiper Joe's mortgage shop refinancing cheap. I mean, the whole cost of refinancing a mortgage went down because the infrastructure changed, because the world had changed. So the statistics that this was modeled on weren't very valid. Instead of needing 1.5 points or whatever was the traditional spread that would trigger someone refinancing his mortgage, maybe now it was only 0.75 points, 0.5 points. So refinancing occurred much faster than the data would show. And so if you don't, the data alone is not enough. You have to understand where it came from. You have to understand the source of stuff that's being given to you, and is it still valid? A much simpler example of misinterpreting data is the following. It has to do with the Air Force and how they train pilots. And I heard this story. I think it's true. Anyway, it's a pretty good story. So, in fact, I heard it from a guy at Rand Corporation. He used to advise the Air Force on highfalutin stuff. So, how do you train pilots? Two algorithms. One obviously worked better than the other. It was this. The first algorithm is when the pilot makes a good landing, this is the trainee, praise him, or her. I guess in those days it was him. When the pilot, okay, and that's one thing. Praise good quality work. In other words, berate the bad landing. Guy makes a bad landing, yell at him, tell him he's going to get washed out, all the rest. Now, so what happened? Well, it was perfectly clear to the general who was reporting that the first approach was lousy and the second approach was good. Because he had the statistics that showed you praise the guy makes a good landing, and his next landing is likely to be not very good. What good did that praise do his next landing? Whereas you beat up on the guy who makes a bad landing, and his next landing is likely to be much better. See? Well, it turns out, of course, if you think about it, it doesn't matter a damn what you do, because landings are pretty likely to be average. So if the guy had a very good landing, his next landing is likely to be average. He had a very bad landing, his next likely to be average. So by slicing the data, only looking what follows good landings and praise, well, I mean, you've only looked at half, one side of the data. And so if you're not careful about how things are selected before you draw conclusions about what happens following that, you can get yourself into trouble. Closer to home is the following phenomenon. we do some asset allocation, so we see a lot of managers. A lot of folks come and show us their records. Now, although I haven't done careful statistics on this, it frequently seems to be the case that the guy does not do as well after I invest my dollar with him than this marvelous record that he showed me. Why is that? Gee, he showed this record. Gee, it's 3 years. Well, when you think about it, well, who's showing you your records? What kind of a sample do you have of people who first appear in your radar screen? Obviously, it isn't fellows who have lost 35% in the last 3 years. Right? Those guys aren't showing anyone their records. So you're seeing a sample of the best people. The people whose records haven't been good, they bide their time, they wait, they hope whoever financed them will stick with them until their record can be good, and then they can show it to me or to you. So I'm seeing a sample of good landers. And fine, I say, okay, I'm invested in this fellow, and gee, guess what? His record going forward is average. It's like everybody else. Now, obviously, some people do better and some people do worse, and there are other factors. But reversion to the mean in both managing money and landing airplanes is probably a pretty persistent phenomenon. So what you have to do when you look at a guy's record, no matter how good it is drag it back. You have to drag it back by comparing him not to the folks whose records you happen to have been brought to you, but from all the records you can possibly get, guys who have gone out of business, and so on and so forth. And you say, gee, this fellow's showing me a Sharpe ratio of 17. Can I really believe it? Not so likely. But gee, he really did it for 2 years. He had this wonderful thing. Well, okay, but the guy who had a Sharpe ratio of minus 17, he didn't walk in my door. See, because, okay, so statistics, where does the data come from? But now, common sense. Even if your data is good, and even if your math is good, sometimes things just don't smell right. And that could be because at the end of the day, you didn't quite look at the right data. A wonderful example years ago was the Mexican peso. This is in the 70s. And the Mexican peso had been fixed for years. It was, as I recall, $12.50 to the dollar, something like that. Anyway, it had been fixed. Fixed. And if you look at a graph of the Mexican peso, because their interest rates were considerably higher than our interest rates, it was a wonderful thing. I mean, you would just buy this in the future, let the discount come in, pocket your money, and go home. And you could turn this over as often as you liked, and there was a pretty good market in the Mexican peso. So if you analyze the data, you say, gee, the volatility is very low. There's a nice slope to this curve. I can carry this back for 11 years, and I get the same relatively low volatility result. Okay? Now, the Mexican peso, at a certain point, proceeded, as you all know, so dimly in any event, to totally collapse and go from 12 to the dollar to 100 to the dollar, and in fact, probably thousands based on the, it went to zero, in fact. So, look, here you had the data, you had the thing, you could do the whole experiment. There had never been an example of the Mexican peso going to zero. On the other hand, so it didn't appear in the data. Go back to Germany and the post-First World War, between the wars or something like that, and find other examples. But the fact is that in a normal analysis of that data, you would not see this event at all. But you had to say to yourself, nothing is this good. Nothing could be this good. It certainly wasn't. It was very amusing at that time. I went to Mexico because I suspected that they were going to devalue the peso. There was other people, I suppose, did too. I mean, the average genius was not just buying this curve. But a remarkable number of people were. Anyway, I went to Mexico. And we interviewed a lot of real Mexicans and stockbrokers, various people. Everyone said the same thing. They said, well, what do you think of the Mexican peso? Oh, solid as a rock. Do you think they'll die? Absolutely not. You yourself keep your deposits at pesos? Certainly. Turned out everyone, the minute he had, 6, whatever you call them, centavos in his pocket, would convert it to a quarter or whatever. These guys were holding no picture. I wouldn't dream of it. So I went home. It was 2 days after I got home that it went. So that was just a fluke. But the point is that underlying this wonderful stream of was a mess. So what do you do about volatility modeling? How do you take this? How do you get your arms around it? Well, there isn't any perfect way, of course. I mean, events of very small probability do occur, and they often can't be predicted. We don't do much of a job of predicting earthquakes or one thing or another. But what you have to do, I think, in modeling volatility is take an extremely long view. And even if you can't find data to support the fact, let's say, that volatility is potentially higher than what it's showing locally or even shown for the last few years, you just got to stick it in. You just have to stick it in. What we typically do in modeling volatility, when we have 20 or 30 years, is say, okay, what's the all-time volatility forever, flat-weighted, just peaks and so on. And then, okay, now what's the local volatility? Because local volatility has a tendency to persist. If something isn't moving much in the last month or two, it's probably not going to move so much in the next few weeks. So you simply want to use the local component, but you have to add in a big dollop of the long-term past, because financial instruments can just change mode and go from being very quiet to being very active in a very short period of time. It's probably the case that all the spreading activity, the convergence activity that went on, that was hurt badly last year, to some extent was probably gulled by seeing rather low levels of spread volatility. As these spreads were coming in, because so many folks, I guess, were buying them, they were vibrating a rather small amount, which presumably would encourage the computers to say, yes, the standard deviation is pretty small, we can pile on. And to some extent, I suppose that was valid. But somewhere in your database, you had to have another factor that said, okay, this volatility is not going to zero. I don't care what it was. There is inherent volatility in here, and we just got to, if we even can't find it in the past because there haven't been enough examples of this stuff, put it in anyway. Just put some floor on to keep yourself or keep your computer from recommending something which sort of violates common sense. So now we come to the good luck part. It's actually, I have a principle, good and bad, but it's luck anyway. Luck. And in my opinion, luck is far and away the most important determinant in any of our lives, right from our birth. All of us here, overwhelming majority of us here, I'm certain, were very fortunate in where they were born, to whom they were born, simply the circumstances of it. We obviously, could have been born in much worse circumstances and probably wouldn't be sitting here. And from that point on, various events, some of very small probability, who you happen to meet and marry, where you take your first job, which school you chose to go to, where the choice could have been so random. These things have an enormous impact on our lives. People have a tendency not to want to accept luck as an important determinant. They like to have explanations, and great. I mean, the sun doesn't come up every morning because of good luck. It comes up because we all know why the sun comes up. So, on the other hand, there was probably some point in time where people thought, here it comes, thank God, here it comes again. But we don't like to accept luck. You listen to, watch an announcer in a basketball game. when you shoot a basket, unfortunately we didn't shoot enough last night, I guess, but when you shoot a basket, it's like, it hits the rim, it's rolling around, it fell off, it went in, there was an elbow in the way. I mean, there's so many random events. So a guy gets 3 in a row. He's really hot. I mean, he's just really lucky. He got 3 in a row. Maybe he got 4 in a row. I mean, if he gets 45 in a row, you might begin to think, hey, maybe this guy is a basketball genius. But most of the time, whether it's, they're terrible, they missed 4 in a row, it's random. And of course the announcer doesn't want to say, by another random event. That's not very interesting. So, so he'll give a reason. But most of the time it's just, who was the last president, who said, gee, the economy has been strong this year. What a stroke of good luck for me. Nothing whatever to do with it. And we all know, sitting around this room, he did have nothing whatever to do with it, but nobody wants to say it. And if it goes bad, he blames it on the other party. Well, the stage that they set before I came in made it impossible for us to. But most of the time, nothing to do with who's president or who isn't president or who used to be president. It has to do with forces outside their control to a large extent. But people don't just want to accept that. And so you have a manager, and gee, his record has not been so good lately. He's had what's going on? Well, maybe something's going on, and of course, it's worth talking to the fellows and so on, making sure that some terrible series of events haven't happened in their shop to decimate the operation, whatever. But most of the time, the answer is, gee, we bought stock X and it went down, and it went down more than we expected, and hopefully the next time we buy stock Y, it will go up. And that's probably all the explanation there is. And we all sort of know that. But it's hard to accept. It's still hard to accept that a person with an exceptionally good record, like us, we have an exceptionally good record, there's a considerable degree of good luck in that. Not all good luck, I guess. But there's more good luck than even I would like to acknowledge. And similarly, you have a bad run, luck there too. So good luck can come a variety of ways. Early on, as I said, we didn't trade with math. It was just the fundamental trade. So here's an example of how I developed a reputation for being a genius. And it was when gold was going through the roof in, I think, 80 or 81. I don't remember. But in less than 12 months, gold went from $200 to $850 and then dropped sharply. It was a great run. So at that time, I had a partner, although I was a boss. And that becomes important in this world. We had decided, okay, well, you manage your account and I'll manage my account. We'll sort of, just neither of us particularly able to listen to the other. But it turned out we both bought gold. And we both bought it around the same price, $200, $250. And we watched our gold go up. And by the time it had doubled, I sold mine. I'm a king. It's $450. Lenny, why don't you sell it? Not me. I'm holding on to this gold. You never know how high it's going to go. And it went to 500 and 550 and 600 and 650. And you have no idea. I mean, the thing was, if you look at the graph today, it's instructive. It kind of looks like the whole internet thing only compressed. I mean, it really happened fast. It really happened fast. So each day I'd say, Lenny, you went to sell the gold. Not me. You never know how high these things can go. And because he was A, my partner, and B, at least as smart as I was, he was great. He was very great. Okay, right, there's a count. All right. So a day came, I walked in the office, it finally broke $800. It was over $800. And I happened to be talking to my stockbroker, just sort of bullshit. And he said, gee, Lucy, my wife, came into my closet this morning and took out all of my cufflinks, old cufflinks, and tie pins. I said, why? Why'd she do that? He said, well, she's a jeweler. These are things I don't wear often. And because she's a jeweler, she only has to stand in the short line. said, what do you mean the short line? He says, don't you know about the lines? I said, no, I don't know about the lines. He said, well, there's lines in the jewelry district of people selling their gold. But the short line is only for jewelers. I said, well, how long? She said, oh, an hour maybe. She we understand that. I said, this was a successful stockbroker. I mean, he had a home on Park Avenue and so on. And his wife standing in line for an hour to sell her gold, to sell his tie pins, and it was only the short line. I said, well, he said, oh yeah, people are standing all day. I said, they're standing all day to sell gold in the street? He said, yeah. I went over to my partner, and I finally exercised droit de seigneur or whatever it is. Pick up the phone, call the broker, sell it. Held it to his ear. I actually dialed. He was so mad at me. Sell the gold. We sold it. Well, we didn't have that. Well, we're fine, a lot. We sold the gold. And the next morning, and nothing. And the next morning he came lumping in. It was up another $20 or $30. I told you. And by that afternoon, it had dropped 200. And it, of course, never recovered. And we would never, Lenny would never have sold it, but he would have ridden it all the way because he doesn't like to sell it. As I suddenly discovered, oh, he's a wonderful, wonderful guy. I did, he holds it, you know. It was good once, why should it be bad now? Not bad. I mean, it served him in good stead. But, so he sold it. And now, well, you know, we made a lot of money on the trade. Congratulate us, took us out to dinner. But if, you know, if I just hadn't happened to be talking to Dick Feller, and if Lucy had not happened to have walked into his office, into his bedroom that morning, I wouldn't have done that, you know, and I wouldn't have been a genius. But it was totally random. Yes.
What does Lenny own today?
I'll tell you what, Lenny owns British pounds that he bought at least 15 years ago when the pound was at $1. Lenny's a bottom fisher. The pound was at $1. The interest rate, well, maybe $1.05 or something. The interest rates were very high. He loaded up with pounds, and I saw him recently. I always ask, how are your pounds doing? Oh, fine. You know, he still has the pounds. You know, once they were good. I don't know what Lenny owns exactly. A lot of cash, I believe. But he. I could tell so many stories about money. Okay, I'm almost at the end of my outline here. It says our system. Oh yeah, our system. So our systems totally depend on that, in the sense that the edge that we have in most of the work that we do and the predictions that we do is very small. What's good is we make a lot of lousy predictions. And because they're not completely lousy, they have a certain edge to them. And there's a lot of opportunities to trade. We do okay. So in the Medallion Fund, which has run for a long time, we reforecast constantly. We're like a weather predictor. We cast our forecast. We look out for the future. And then we do it again 10 minutes later. We do it again a half an hour later. We do it again all during the day. We revise our forecast a little bit to account for the new information that's come in. And we revise our portfolio a little bit. But we're always in and out, in and out, in and out. So our edge is very small, and we depend on enough activity to make us some money. So, but you know, I don't walk into the office in the morning and say, gee, you know, am I smart today? I walk in the office and say, look, am I lucky today? And is, you know, are things breaking our way or not? Because all of these statistical models are just that. They're statistical models. And there's variance in it. And we live with that variance, as we really all do. So I have a last note here. Steve said, well, if you have anything to sell, this is an opportunity to sell it. I will take 1 minute and tell you, the Medallion Fund has been closed for a long time and will not open simply because it does do very, very fast trading, and we move the markets considerably, and we just don't want to abuse that situation. So it's been closed for exactly 6 years, well, since June of '93. But for a long time, we've been working on how to develop some much longer-term signals in the equities market that look stable and could lead to a slow trading system, and which signals we could incorporate into Medallion, but also could we make a product out of could we make a slow trading product? And we've developed a product which we launched 2 months ago and promptly dropped a few percent. However, I'm very encouraged by it. We spent about 4 years and a lot of people's time and money, my money, all of our money, working on this. And I think we have something that's very, very good. It's a long, short, very slow-moving system. The turnover's 6 months or something. I mean, the holding periods tend to be pretty long. What's the latest? The order 6 months. Yeah. This is Peter Alstrom who will accept your checks after all. It runs with $2 long and $2 short for $1 of capital. It has a volatility of about half that of the S&P, I think, in this incarnation, and very nice simulated return over many years. The problem with longer-term signals is you really have to be careful because you don't have as many samples as you do. Obviously, the very short-term signals just keep appearing and appearing and appearing and appearing. Longer-term signals, you really have to study and understand their consistency and persistence and, to some extent, why they occur and so on. And you have to do a good job of covariance modeling, both of which we've done reasonably well. So we developed this system. We started accepting investors at the end of April, I think. April? Something like that, middle of April. And this is a fund that we will put a lot of attention to. We'll keep modifying as everything we do keeps changing as we learn more. And we'll be open, we hope, for a long time. And it's a transparent fund. You can always see what the portfolio is if you were interested. It doesn't change very fast, and there's nothing. You wouldn't get any great proprietary insight by looking at it. But it is a product that we have worked hard on, that we are now trying to take some money that will hopefully be blessed with a share of good luck. And that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Jim. Are there any questions or comments?
I'm wondering if the Knicks game last night, was that a result of a butterfly flapping his wings?
Oh. I don't know. I didn't watch enough of it to make that determination. Not at all.
Given the difficulties with traditional statistical models, have you tried any of the alternatives to solving mathematics, like logic sets or any of those kinds, any experimentation with that?
Well, yeah, yes and no. We've looked at some of that stuff. It hasn't been. I had a funny conversation. You mentioned butterfly wings, and that made me think of chaos, which has been all the rage. And I was with a very famous scientist about 2 or 3 years ago when we had lunch, and I said, "Boy, this chaos theory, it just seems like baloney. Don't you think 90% of it is baloney?" And he said, "No." I said, "No. I think 80% of it is baloney." And he was serious. There's something there. None of that stuff has been especially effective. At the end of the day, you see, you can't get away from the statistics. I mean, you can use neural nets or some way or other, which is, or some method of finding some model. But at the end of the day, you have to test it out, and you have to use rigorous statistics. And you're captive, you're captive to that. You can't really get around it, so it's not a perfect tool, but these others are just routes to getting models. And sometimes, years ago, we had some guys, and they built an extremely complicated model. And never mind how they got to it, but it was a very complicated model. It was doing fine, and then it was doing not so fine. I said, well, can't we understand more about what this model is? It's so complicated. He said, oh, no, you can't understand it because See, what we've done is we've added this and that and put it all together, and we've maximized here and there and so on. Who the hell knows what it is? You know, that is not satisfactory. By the way, that's not unusual either in certain methodologies of modeling. You know what it is? I said, I want to know what it is. A, it's losing money, so I know it's rotten. But B, let's figure out what it is. He said, okay, well, I gave him some experiments, and we said, well, we'll just look at it. We'll constrain it to a couple of parameters. We'll just look at what the function is along in a very small set of parameters, and these are the important ones. And we'll just look at a part of the function. Oh, okay, so we ginned it all up and put it from scratch. And guess what? It was a linear function. Now, ax plus by plus cz. That's what the function was. Oh, yes, it had little twists here and curls here. It didn't matter a damn. It was a linear model. We could have derived that model in 15 minutes, as it turns out, at the core of it. And all the rest of the garbage that made it this fancy model didn't mean anything. And in fact, linear predictive systems weren't doing very well during that period. And naturally, this model was losing money. But unless we tore it apart and did that, we never would have known what it was. And the danger with some of these methods, and I think neural networks is one, where it's a learning machine. You give it all this stuff, and it will finally come up with the best way it sees to extrapolate and model the data or something. You know what it did? So it'll give you something, and gee, you simulate it, and it looks pretty good, but there's this air of anxiety because you don't understand it. So we don't do a lot of that stuff unless we can understand what it is.
When I went to business school, something that was very established in business school was two things. Look, you really, technical analysis don't work at all. And on the other side of the spectrum was like, you cannot never build a system that beats the market. Or if you build a system that beats the market, it's gonna stop working very quickly after a while.
Right.
But then when you start working, you start figuring out that you see people making money with these two things. And some people having a very hard time making money using like fundamental analysis, which everybody's using. I just wanted to see your comments regarding why does the academic world refuse so much the idea of system building?
Well, for one thing, this sort of all comes under the rubric of the efficient market hypothesis, that the markets know everything and you can't improve on that just by looking at the history of the prices or something like that. It's a very elegant hypothesis, and academics like elegant hypotheses. To first order, it's right. I mean, there are no gross inefficiencies. If there were gross inefficiencies, as you say, people would see them, trade them out, and that would be the end of the day. If coffee went up every day on Tuesday and down every day on Wednesday by 10% of it, you would notice, and then everyone would buy it Tuesday morning and sell it Wednesday morning or whatever it would be, and that would quickly go away. So it's true at the gross level that these kinds of inefficiencies, that the market is reasonably efficient, and so you can write a lot of papers and so on to show this, but it's not true to second order. It's not true at final levels. I mean, we for example, look at patterns that exhibit themselves, inefficiencies or anomalies whose life is hours or days. Most academics aren't looking at that stuff. Also, most academic research is based on studies without transaction costs. Now, that should actually make these anomalies look better, not more exploitable, not less. But that's the conventional wisdom, is that the markets are efficient, but it isn't right. But it's right grossly, and it produces a lot of papers. So that's good.
My question is, my question is about the euro.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the mortgage-backed issue, that a lot of people are building backtesting on a very limited database.
Yes.
And my question about the euro is it just another currency? I mean, I know the ECU is traded for a number of years, but is it really just like any other currency? Can you model it like any other currency?
Well, one won't really know whether you can model it like any other. I mean, you can model it. Your question is, can you successfully model it like any other?
Well, I think
model
that's
anything.
your opinion.
Can you do it with success? And we won't know that for some time. There's no reason to think it's not. We have never encountered a commodity, let's call currencies, things that trade fast, and so we'll call those commodities. We've never encountered one that didn't generally behave like the others. So if the euro is not susceptible to modeling, it would be the first serious example of an instrument like that wasn't. But on the other hand, how do you tune up your models? What you would do? Well, I mean, we've had trouble with the euro this year. There's been political interference, there's been intervention, there's people. I think the levels of trading activities on the currency desks are lower this year than ever, and that's been coming down. The appetite for risk among the bank traders has diminished. The euro has probably made them even more concerned because of all the political juggling that goes on. But at the end of the day, assuming the thing lasts as an instrument, I have little doubt it will behave like others. And we model it. In fact, we started modeling it using the parameters of the Deutschmark. And as we because the Deutschmark is the largest component in it, and as we learn more, we'll change things a little bit. But from instrument to instrument, the differences aren't that big. We've discovered, historically at least, that if a new instrument comes along, initially we'll just model it like sort of the average. We'll just, cycle its volatility. Other factors we'll just put in like, okay, this is an average instrument. We'll just take average, and that works well. And then over time, you can begin to tune. So that's pretty much. But the euro, we figured, we just started with the Deutschmark model, and I don't see much of it be okay in the long run.
Your stocks program, are the inputs pure price, and when you control your volatility, is sector constraining your longs or your shorts?
The inputs are not pure price, although many of the inputs are price. There are other time series associated with the instruments that we use. So that's question one. Now, what was the other one? How do we control the sector? We actually have a sector bet in this system. So we will be, at given times, heavier in one sector and lighter in another sector. The volatility is controlled overall rather than we insist on being balanced within each sector. We know the correlation of sector to sector and the volatility within the sector. So there's a optimization which keeps you under control. But the sectors are from time to time unbalanced because we have a prediction that says this sector ought to overperform or this sector ought to underperform. So, we don't like to put in constraints for the sake of putting in a constraint. You can say, okay, we will be balanced in every sector. Okay? But then you give up some return for that. It's true you reduce your volatility, obviously, but you give up some return, so you have to just look at the trade-off. And a better trade-off is to say, okay, put a risk control in for every sector. But if you have a prediction, let the risk control take care of how much you're going to allocate to this imbalance. So that's what it is.
Okay. A review of the academic literature on anomalies in the markets sometimes seems a little bit ironic given the last 18 months where the small cap effect has worked in reverse and the value effect has worked in reverse. This leads one to ask the question as to whether the belief that value and small cap would outperform over long periods of time is simply a data mining of a small sample. Do you believe that there are inefficiencies in the pricing of value stocks relative to growth stocks and small cap stocks relative to large cap stocks?
It's a good question. The large cap, small cap phenomenon, which is obviously gone in one direction until perhaps very recently, for the last few years, that small caps outperform big caps. You can see it in the data if you run the data back far enough. That is, it's not a very consistent phenomenon. There are long periods, like this one, when large caps were favored over small caps in the history. There are more periods when small caps were favored over long caps, but now you're dealing with decades at a time. So, something that has a certain bias, but you need to look at 75 or 100 years of data to really nail the bias down, we ain't going to live 75 or 100 years. So you more. I don't suppose. Looking around here, there aren't many of us who are going to live another 100 years. So these are very, very weak statistical things, and that's the point. With something like that, if you just use the last 5 years, you would conclude, hey, large caps uber alles, right? Because I don't know what the exact number of years is, but for the last several years, obviously large caps have way outperformed small caps. And one could maybe gin up some reason why you think, yes, you see, because of index trading and everyone wants to be in the index, and that's always going to be pulling more money into it. That's probably just as much baloney as anything else. Lately, for no doubt, reasons which are temporal, large caps have outperformed small caps. The next 5 years, it might be the opposite. But I don't think that is a serious inefficiency in the sense that it's so weak that you can't exploit it. It would be foolish to exploit it. Was that your whole question?
That was my whole question.
Fine.
Jim, more generally, there are a wide variety of so-called market neutral, dollar neutral, stat arb long-term programs, many of which, most of which, have struggled for the past 12, 18, 24 months perhaps. In your assessment, from your perspective, is that because of bad luck or a breakdown in the nature of the models, or just the cycle that they're going through?
I don't know. Our only stat arb inside Medallion has performed fabulously this year. So, and I think that there are other, I have heard of other fellows who have performed very well too, and I've also heard some who have done poorly, and undoubtedly some of it's luck. You develop statistical programs are not different from other things in the following sense. Let's take a man or a woman, like my ex-wife was beat up on me for so many years with this.